equation by factoring by grouping. Find all real and imaginary solutions. For this particular problem, we're going to do two examples. The first example is x cubed minus 3x squared plus 4x minus 12 is equal to 0. So we have four terms, and we want to factor by grouping. So I'm going to group the first two terms, and I'm going to group the second two terms. Looking at the first two terms, I see that there's the greatest common factor of x squared. I'm going to go ahead and factor that out, and I have x squared times x minus 3. I'm going to bring down the plus sign in the middle, and now I'm going to look at the second two terms, 4x minus 12. And I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor from those two terms, which is a 4. And if I do that, I'm left with x minus 3 as well is equal to 0. I'm going to go back and I'm going to take a moment and check here. X squared times x is x cubed. X squared times negative 3 is negative 3x squared. 4 times x is 4x. 4 times negative 3 is negative 12. So I notice here and here I have a common binomial of x minus 3. I'm going to go ahead and write that down, x minus 3, and I'm going to write down what I'm left with, the x squared plus 4. X squared plus 4 is equal to 0. Now I have two binomials set equal to 0. The next thing I'm going to apply is the zero product rule, which I've written over here. If a and b are algebraic expressions and the product of the two is equal to 0, then we can set each of them equal to 0. So here is our first expression. Here is our second expression. I'm going to set each of those equal to 0. So I have x minus 3 is equal to 0, and x squared plus 4 is equal to 0. Now I'm going to solve each one. This one is simply adding 3 to both sides of the equation to find that x is equal to 3. Here, I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides of the equation, and I find that x squared is equal to negative 4. The next thing I want to use is the square root property. I've isolated the square term here, the x squared, and I want to solve for x, so I'm going to square root both sides of this equation. That will undo the x squared, and I will have x is equal to, and I'm going to write a plus or minus since I've introduced the square root, plus or minus, the square root of 4 is 2, and I have a negative underneath the square root, which I will write as plus or minus 2i. So the solutions to this equation are plus or minus 2i and 3. Now we're going to come over here and do a second equation. So we have 2x cubed plus x squared minus 14x minus 7. And again, I'm going to factor by grouping. We have four terms, and this is one technique that we may be able to use to factor four terms. So from the first two terms, I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor of x squared. And if I do that, I'm left with 2x plus 1. I'll check that. 2x squared, or x squared times 2x is 2x cubed. X squared times 1 is x squared. Looking at the second two terms, I see that they're both divisible by 7, and they're both negative. I'm going to go ahead and factor out a negative 7. If I do that, I'm left with 2x plus 1 as well. Take a moment to check that factorization. Negative 7 times 2x is negative 14x. Negative 7 times 1 is negative 7. So looking here as well as here, I see I have a common binomial of 2x plus 1. I'm going to go ahead and write that common binomial down, 2x plus 1. And I'm going to write down what I'm left with. The x squared minus 7. X squared minus 7. And a second set of parentheses. Now I'm going to apply the zero product rule. I'm going to set the 2x plus 1 equal to 0 and the x squared minus 7 equal to 0. And I'm going to solve each one. Here I'll subtract 1 from both sides. I get 2x is equal to negative 1 and divide by 2. So my first solution that I've located is x is equal to negative 1/2. For the second equation here, I'm going to use the square root property. I have x squared. So I'm going to isolate x squared by adding 7 to both sides. I have x squared is equal to 7. I want to solve for x. So I want to get x by itself. So I'll square root both sides. And I get x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 7. So our final answer here is negative 1/2 and plus or minus the square root of 7 for our solutions. So we have solved two equations involving 4 terms each by factoring by grouping.